Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Steam Whistle. This is a Georgia Tech Sports Podcast. I'm Daniel Horde, and today I have a very special guest with me who I'll be interviewing about his life and about his time at Georgia Tech and about Georgia Tech basketball as a whole. This is Tommy Taylor. He is a former Georgia Tech basketball player who played in the late 60s and early 70s under Coach Wack Heider. Tommy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. If you hear the Army song in the background, that's my clock. So it's going off in a second. But I'm doing really great. Thank you.
And thanks for coming on. You have a very just fascinating life, just in terms of where you've been and the people you've met and places you've seen. But for listeners, just to sum up, where were you born, and just sort of describe what your childhood was like.
Well, that's a interesting story. I was born 7 miles south of Whigham, Georgia, on a farm. And the farm had 30,000 chickens and about 150 acres of row crops. So that was, I would say I'm from Whigham, Georgia, but it had 400 people that lived in it, and I wasn't one of those 400. I lived south of Whigham. And then growing up, high school was the lowest classification in Georgia, which was Class C, and that consisted of all the teams that had at least 150 students in the school. We had about 151 maybe. Class sizes were, this is in the high school, class sizes are about 20 to 25, 30, somewhere in those ranges. But it was a Hoosier type of sports, basketball particularly. And during we started playing, of course, 5, 6 years old, when you could go down to the woods and cut a pole up that was straight enough, usually a poplar tree. You nail some boards together and made a backboard. And for Christmas, you might get a goal to put on it, the net every year, and a ball. So they talk about playing on tar courts. We played on a dirt court with one goal. And it was just brothers playing, cousins playing and we could watch TV on Sundays and see Jerry West playing for the Lakers. And he taught him a jump shot. And of course, and it was just, when you get on up through middle school, it's called grammar school and high school at those days. But to get on up into that range of time, we had a good coach that would reach down into the lower schools and lower grades and find players and start grooming them, developing them up through high school. So I went to one school, 12 grades, starting on the far right-hand corner of the flat, long building and graduating on the upper left-hand corner of it, all in the same school for 12 years. So that just about wraps it. And I played every sport there was. We didn't have football, but we had basketball. And for basketball season, year-round conditioning, we played baseball and ran track. And then my parents both were, my mom ran the chicken business and my dad ran the row cropping business. If I wanted to practice after school and after the bus left, I'd have to run home about 7 miles.
Oh, my goodness.
And that's how I became a distance runner. I wound up as a senior winning the state a mile and the 2 mile run on a Friday and Saturday in the state Class C championships. Didn't know anything about running. Until the state championship, I ran in Chuck Taylor high tops. But Coach said, we're going out here on this hard cinder court here. It wasn't cinder, it was a textured material. And I got some shoes here for you, some track shoes. He said, if you win both of those events, you don't have to pay me the $4 for them. And I said, okay. And $4 was a lot of money in those days for a high school kid. So I went up and won the mile. And I think the time was 4:40 and the 2 mile was 10:28.
Wow.
But
I ran cross country in middle and high school. I was not any good. But it's a very, you know, I respect people who have done it, because it's, you know, when you think of track, when people think of track and they think of events, they think of the sprinters and all the exciting events like the 100-meter, 400-meter, stuff like that. But cross country and distance running, I from someone who's done it, and then also just with that in context, I have utmost respect for people who do it. It's not an easy sport. You have to have a lot of endurance for it.
No, it conditions you, like the coach wanted us to do it for basketball. And our basketball team was, when I mentioned Hoosiers before, it was that kind of a small town. And we were surrounded by larger schools. AA and AAA was the largest in those days. And to have enough games on the schedule, we had to play everybody. So we, senior year, we were number one in the state in Class C. We went on up and played some AAA teams and AA teams, and we beat them. Went on up into the state tournament in Macon at the time. And in the 4 games we played, we averaged a point margin of 31 points a game against all of our opponents. And that may be a record somewhere, because I haven't seen 31 points in average per game in a tournament lately. But it was in those days you ran what some call later on the Princeton offense. You press full court defense. You no blocks, no 3-pointers or anything like that. So to average 80 to 90 points a game in 4 8-minute quarters, you had to be moving.
Yeah.
And that's where your total year conditioning, not basketball. I was frowned upon that a little bit when you have to play basketball year-round, but other sports gave you what a distance runner would need, or even a sprinter. Baseball was a little slower game, but we did that too. But the idea of 50 to 75 cars following a school bus to the next town 15 or 20 miles over reminded me of the Hoosiers movie. And it was put in the Atlanta Journal at the time, after all the tournaments were done, that everybody, the coaches, particularly Coach Hyder, Georgia Tech, and Coach Roseman in Georgia, wanted to have a single tournament state championship. And it named Whigham High and Johnson of Savannah as the 2 most likely to play in that championship. So we felt pretty good about being able to play against a AAA team in a state championship, but that never took off the ground. So they still have not hundreds, but dozens of different levels of championships today. But that was an interesting high school career. Kind of got me ready for college.
Well, your team was just dominant through the state tournament, or state classification tournament. And when did you start getting? Was this your senior year when y'all won state?
Senior, 1968, and one day I got selected to the All-Star team, and All-American honors. Then there was no media, there was no publications. We had a local weekly newspaper, and we had a retired Army colonel that announced the state championship games when on the radio. I don't know if it's a radio or not, but we certainly never had TV or anything. But it was the same starting 5 minus 1 maybe. Actually played 8th grade, 9th grade. I mean, we had varsity starting 9th grade, but we played together like 3-4 years, and went to the tournament each of the 3 years, but we always lost somewhere in the first or second round. But that 4th year was the what I used to like to see, still like to see it, 5 players playing together for several years, and learning each other, learning the game, learning the coach, and then winning championships. I won't reflect much on today compared to that, but that's a lot of things you miss out on when you don't get to experience in high school even playing different sports, doing all the high school things you would do, playing with the same teammates and coach. So the basketball academies are taking that away from high school, and players go off into basketball year-round at that point and miss out on a lot of what you should be having fun in high school doing.
Yeah, it's AAU. I really have been against just how that's grown, and overtime elite, which as Tech fans we know about lately, with how many guys we've been recruiting out of there. But with how many people there are and how popular basketball is, there is still to an extent that sort of camaraderie and high school. Now, as a senior, you're helping your team win the state championship. How was it what was recruiting like, being recruited by colleges? When did you start getting noticed?
It was mostly, like I said, not a lot of media, word of mouth, coaches. I think in the 10th grade, where my high school coach went to junior college, and in Chipola, Florida, we'd go to camps. Valdosta was one camp I'd go to. Chipola had a camp. But that's where you kind of started picking up interest, maybe sophomore, junior, and senior year. And in the hometown, like I said, this lieutenant colonel retired that would broadcast the games. He had several kids that played off in different colleges. So you'd jump in the car on a weekday or Friday or Saturday and go down and try out somewhere. You do it at camps. But my senior year, started getting ratings, so to speak, in the Atlanta Journal and two papers, Constitution and Journal, would have a top 25 players in the state, and that would include all classes of high schools. So when it started getting published in that every week or so, and then our team, of course, was rated number one, and we were knocking off AAA teams, it got some interest from coaches around. But I was a 5'11" forward in high school.
Oh my goodness! Oh,
so you talk about going to college, and that's a story in itself, being a point guard in a Division I college. But we had a 6'3" or 6'4" center. I had obviously was a forward because there was two guards shorter than me. But I had about a 36-inch vertical leap that I could rebound and actually dunk the ball, even though it wasn't allowed. I had large hands and a wing spread. It's probably helped even in college, was having an arm wing spread of about a 6'6" guy. Had long arms, big hands, and you jump well. So it was no problem averaging 23, I think, in my high school senior year and averaging 11 rebounds. So I was kind of an oddball going into college. I did play my first game at guard on the state South All-Star team my senior year summer. And I think, and not having ever played guard before, it was basically the basics. If you can dribble, you can shoot, you can pass, you can catch, you can rebound, and you can play defense, you should be able to play any position on the court. And I'd already had a lot of experience inside and on the wings. Our gym was built in the 1940s, and it had a ceiling so low that if you were on the point and took a shot, you'd hit the rafters on a jump shot. So to score, people figured that out as they come to play us the second time anyway, but you had to shoot all your shots from the corner or the wings if you're going to shoot an outside shot.
Or that's if you're going to shoot. I'm imagining that the best strategy is just to go inside.
Go inside, yeah. So I was the leading scorer on the team, but I was not a guard. I was inside, constant movement, the shuffle, all the old coaches of the day. Garland Penstolder had the wheel. Penstolder, Oglethorpe had the wheel. There was a shuffle. There was all the movement offenses. Because there's no point in shooting from 25 or 30 feet. It counted 2 points if you could make it. And it was all about the basics and the fundamentals of complete any position playing. I didn't know what a point guard really was. We started out with 2 guards outside. Maybe one was shifted around to be up on the point, but everybody was moving inside, screening, moving, just the whole shuffle, movement offense. And you ran at full speed. And we hardly ever took anywhere from 8 to 12 seconds to get a shot, or maybe 2 off. If you can imagine, a small gym with rafters, and just people hated to play there. But we had a home court advantage for sure. But going into the recruiting question, I started getting letters from schools in the Southeast, and even Brigham Young sent somebody over to watch me play. We never knew they were there usually. But I started getting letters from coaches. Some I remember, Ray Mears sent me something from Tennessee. North Carolina State, Norm Sloan was there at the time. And all the junior colleges and 4-year colleges in Georgia. And Coach Hyder started noticing me and paying interest in me probably my junior and senior year. And Coach Hyder was the kind of coach that he kind of wanted his players to be if he could find them. He grew up on a farm, 8 brothers and sisters like I had 7 brothers and sisters. He had 7. He played every sport there was.
I think he lettered in, and he may have lettered in more, but I know for sure he lettered in baseball and basketball at Tech.
He is, and people won't want to publish this. I wish I could make them, but he lettered in 4 sports and played 5. He was at Tech on a football scholarship because they didn't have basketball scholarships until 1948. So Bobby Dodd, Coach Alexander and Bobby Dodd were up there talking at his high school, Monroe High School, Monroe A&M or whatever it was called at the time. They come up to see another basketball player, and they saw him, and he got an offer to go down and play at Georgia Tech, but his family couldn't afford to send him there. So they gave him a football scholarship, and he played football 3 years on the scrub team, the scout team, and quite a football player. Then he lettered in basketball, track, cross country, and baseball. And a very good baseball player. He was drafted by the Yankees and played on the farm teams. And up through the middle, up through Ohio mainly, and then some in North Carolina and some in Georgia.
I've heard a story about that apparently I think it was Akron, but one of the Yankees affiliates, I think, had Al Sorado as the broadcaster, and I think I've heard a story that Wack was the one.
I'll tell you the story that Coach Hyder told me, and Al told me the same thing, is that Coach Hyder was in Akron, I forget what they were called, playing baseball. He was an outfielder mainly. And there was an announcer there that was announcing the games named Al Sorado. And they got to be friends there because this was 1938, maybe 39. And so when Al came to Atlanta, he went on up in his broadcasting career, came to Atlanta in the middle 50s. And they met again. And the coach asked him, hey, will you come announce our games? Now, this was in Georgia Tech basketball. Was in I'd say its infancy, but it was already 30. It started in 1920, so it was already 30 years old.
But it wasn't really a relevant sport yet, at least in terms. I mean, I think they won one SEC title in the 30s, but they weren't really, popular. They were still playing in the old gym, I think.
The gyms at Georgia Tech started out as an outdoor court, where the Edge building was. The Fanning building will be in the future. Outdoor court, they had to, if it rained or wind blew, they had to go find a gym somewhere to play in high school usually. Then it moved into the next court was in what they call the old Foundry, which was they call it the Crystal Palace, which was one of the academic buildings where you'd weld and do all the things that a mechanical person might do in a technical school. But they'd use that in the as a gym, put a court in it. Then the next was a wooden building that was built, then it burned down in the early 30s.
And then the Armory.
Pardon me?
Then the Armory, I think, was after that, which is...
Well, they had to play a couple years again in the auditorium downtown. And then the Armory, during the late 30s, there's a lot of federal projects. And the Naval Armory was one of those they built because Tech had ROTC and they had Navy. So they got some federal money to build that. Then they played, when Coach Hyder played in the 33 to 37, he finished up in the Naval Armory playing there. They had so few seats, maybe you could seat about 600 or 700, but they wouldn't let the public buy tickets or come to the games because they wanted students in the stands. So there was no public attendance for his senior year, senior year. And Coach Hyder played forward, I guess, in the team, but after every shot or goal made, you jumped at center court again. So in track, he was a hurdler and a high jumper, so he'd jump center after every goal made.
I'm happy they got rid of that rule. Oh my goodness.
Yes. That was the last year they had that, 37. They went undefeated in the SEC then, but they had tournaments and they didn't win the tournament. In 38, the year after he graduated, they went back, won regular season and the tournament, and that was their SEC championship year in 38.
And I think that 38, the season after that, but in the year 1938 was when the old gym or Heisman gym was built.
Right. That was the Heisman gym, and it was built, and then they started letting fans, non-students, come in to see. And then when they have Kentucky down, they would actually Kentucky. The second time Kentucky lost in the same month in 1955. I think they brought their own broadcasting crew down to put it on national TV. But through the years, if they had a big game like a Georgia game or something like that, they'd actually close circuit TV over to the from that gym over to the overflow gym, which was the old Naval Armory. So they were actually kind of doing technology to have more fans coming in through closed circuit TV.
I think it sat that the Heisman gym sat, I think, maybe 1,800, I think 900 aside.
Something like that, yeah.
And so it was, it was bigger than what they had before, but, 55, I would say, is probably maybe the most important season Tech ever had, even though they weren't, they didn't have a great year. I don't even know if they had a winning record, but they had a terrible year the year prior. They won 2 games, and then they go, I think, 12-13 and beat Kentucky twice, and it was just such a forward step, and that really sort of ushered in the success that Coach Hyder would have throughout the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. So Coach Hyder, recruits you. What was did you go on I'm assuming you went on like an official visit or just visit the school?
Yeah, he invited me. I visited several places, but I always knew I wanted to go to Tech, but I just wanted to really get off the farm for a couple of days and somebody else paying for it. So I went and visited Tennessee, and I went to North Carolina State. And the third visit was to Georgia Tech. And there, of course, I drove up there in my 67 Fairlane 500 GT. My mom actually bought me a car my senior year, $2,700. But anyway, so I drove up, and I met the coach. I met Rich Junkus and Jim Thorne. They were my escorts, my sponsors for my weekend there. So Coach gave us all $20 and said, y'all going out to Six Flags. And we spent the day at Six Flags. And it took Jim and Rich from Illinois and Ohio, it took us a while to understand each other's languages. It's pretty funny. I know Southern Georgia boy trying to speak fast enough so the Midwest boys could understand me. But we had a good time. Rode a lot of rides. They had a good time because they got $20 and got to go to Six Flags. So we come back after that, and Coach is showing me around the fairly new Alexander Memorial Coliseum.
Which people don't know, but because even with the old Coliseum, it had been, before McCamish was built, it had been renovated a couple times. They had lowered the floor, put suites in. But back then, it was essentially just a circular grandstand with a floor in the middle. And then, of course, the tunnels go into the annex building, which had the freshman gym. But it was essentially just a circular pit of 7,000 seats.
It was that. It was to finish a little story on the fact of him making me an offer to come to Georgia Tech. Standing up there for, I guess, I forget which, it's probably if you're looking north to south, it's the south side up on the, where you have an entrance there where students come in today even. We're looking over the court, and he says, I want to make you an offer to come here on a full scholarship. And you don't have to worry about any money. Everything's paid for. And our policy here, Coach Dodd was the athletic director then, and still the football coach, I guess. He might have been actually not the football coach my senior year in high school. But he says his policy is, if you come here, we offer you a scholarship. You get to stay till you graduate, unless you break a law or violate some school rules. So that was actually a 4-year scholarship offer. Everything paid for. He said, don't worry about any money. Don't pay anybody any money for anything. We got all that covered. And but I'll tell you, you're going to be, I didn't know what a role player was, but you're going to be a role player for our team. I know you can score. I know you can rebound. I know you can handle the ball. I saw you play in the state all-star game, and you and Big Joby Wright were the only two that could get the ball down the court. He was the center then on our team. He went on to Indiana. But it was just that power dribbling and rough toughness to break through traps and all that he was looking for. And he said, I know you can do all that. We have a freshman team. You'll play on the freshman team. And for your first year, because they didn't start that until I think 1973, where you could be on the varsity.
Yep.
And he says, you roll, you go have fun on your freshman team, score all you can, all you want to. But your role on the varsity is not going to be the score. It's to play tough defense, and it's to get the ball down the court and get our offensive sets going. And be a point guard, and you'll work your way into playing time, but it's not guaranteed. And I usually play my seniors and juniors ahead of my sophomores. And your job is to get the ball to youngest and get back in defense. And that was it. Okay, Coach, I understand that. Can I sign the scholarship right now? He says, no, we'll mail it to you. Don't worry about that. So it was like I knew what I was getting into, and I knew I was going to get a 4-year education or graduate. And that's why I have so much trouble understanding the way things are today. Not just the basketball itself. I watch that closely to see if I can see any resemblance of how it used to be. But the whole administration of college athletics is totally foreign to me. But and I think this would be, looking back now 50 years earlier, that would be foreign to anybody in the basketball business today, player, coach, or athletic director. And I thought about that for a while. And I said, if I look back 50 years from when I was playing at Tech, those playing then, like I said, jumping center court after every shot, shooting two-hand set shots instead of jump shots, running fast breaks, all that. They didn't imagine that would ever change, probably.
Yeah, and like I think Frank Broyles played at Tech, and I listened to one of his interviews, and he said, like, I forget exactly, but he mentioned some final score from when he played, and it was like 21-19 or something like that, and I'm like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Things change, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, but, the styles change, and that applies to sports too. So you get to Tech. That must have been like a culture shock for you, just because you're from this, you grew up on a farm, you're from a small town. Well, you said you grew up outside of town, but Wiggin's a small town, and I think even today it has maybe 500 people, probably less.
Maybe probably 400 still.
And you come up to Atlanta, which of course Atlanta, it hadn't blown up yet. This is pre-Olympics, pre-major. No, it's not pre-major sports. This is late 60s. Major sports had just gotten there, but it was, it was still a relatively big city, and for you that must have been quite a change.
Well, it was the transition took a little bit of time. I think there was three. They used to have a sign up. I keep telling the number of people in Atlanta. I think it was 3 million, or I forget the number. It's many times more than that now. But I did have an aunt and uncle in Atlanta, so it wasn't like being totally away from home. My uncle ran a restaurant. He'd invite the team over to have steak dinners, fried chicken dinners. So everything kind of worked out good there as far as missing home. I stayed in a dorm, Towers dorm on the interstate, which was pretty active then, but on the interstate, and you could see the varsity several hundred yards away. And for the first week or two, I probably didn't sleep because all I'd hear is ambulances and fire trucks going down the interstate, and I'd smell the varsity. So I said, it's not like crickets and chickens or anything I'd been used to. So, but I transitioned pretty good. I think the freshman year is very important to transition into college, not only from the academics, but from the sports and the travel and the meeting new people and the whole thing there. But I was in the best of all worlds because the Hawks had just come to town that year. And we
they shared the building with y'all.
Oh, they shared. Yeah, it was so much sharing going on. But having that, and then we could go through the back door, the team could, players, and the guard would let us in, and we'd climb up then the upper deck where Al Serraldo had his broadcast booth, had a ladder going straight up. And we'd just come through the door, wouldn't have to go down a tunnel or anything. You just walk on straight up into Al's ladder and climb up. And we'd watch the pro games in his booth. And I must have I saw, of course, every time we were in town and they were in town, I'd see every game. And I'd see Jerry West shooting his jump shots, where I used to just see it on TV. We had a little side story. We had a conditioning program. We ran at the end of every practice. We'd go up and down those flights of stairs in McCamish. It was Alexander at the time. But we'd run 10 times up and down the stairs. And there was what we called a pity pat, where you stay right foot, left foot, right foot on every stair, and then go up to the next one. So it's like 3 times the number of stairs you go. But that gave us foot quickness and stamina to play the games. So after practice one day, And the Hawks would always come in, or the visiting team would come in and practice after our practices. And we didn't have weight training. There was no weights around the gym or anything. There was one weight room for the football players, but there was no weights for basketball. Nobody lifted weights. But I kept my strength up by doing chin-ups in the men's bathroom upstairs. So I'm in there doing my 10 or 20 or whatever chin-ups I was doing. And then comes Wilt Chamberlain.
Oh, my gosh. Did he even fit through the door?
Oh, he had to bend down. So I was finishing my chin-ups, and Wilt was doing what he needed to do over at the urinal. And then we had a little laugh and started talking. I said, well, this is my weight room. He says, yeah, this is the only bathroom I could find, too. Because you had to walk up the stairs to get to the bathroom then, unless you went back up the tunnel and round about. So his legs, his arms are bigger than my legs, me standing beside him. So, and then another time, who was a big forward who played for one of the big forwards or centers, they'd go across and stay in the Biltmore when the pros would come to town. So we, little college kids, we'd follow them over there and see if we could talk to him or get an autograph or something. But Bill Russell.
Oh, yes.
Bill Russell was walking back over, and everybody, players visiting pro, college, whatever, they'd wear coat and ties and all that. We'd always wear coat and tie on the road. But he dropped his tie going into the Biltmore. Now, you remember the thing about the kid following Mean Joe Green or somebody dropped his something in some Coke commercial. Anyway, I picked up the tie and went and called up with Bill and said, Mr. Russell, here's your tie. And he says, just keep it. I don't need it. I still got the Bill Russell chartreuse-looking tie. So those were the days of they'll never be replicated, because the Hawks played there. Pete Maravich was a year older than me. He came in and was signed with the Hawks then. Pete didn't adjust well with the Hawks. They were all married, living off somewhere, and he was single. He didn't know what to do with his money. He gave him a little bit. They didn't give him all of his $1.7 million or whatever he signed for. But we'd practice. We'd play pickup games with Pistol after the practices and stuff.
Did Youngkus and Pistol ever play against each other in pickup?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Those must have been some scoring battles.
It was, 3-on-3 and stuff. So Pete had a lot more moves than he ever showed. Let me tell you that. He has a magic with the ball. But my younger brothers and two brothers, one I think age, and one was 10 at the time, 8 and 10. They caught the bus from Wiggum. Mom put them on the bus, and they went to Cairo, I think, to take a bus. They come up to visit me during Christmas, my sophomore year, I guess. And they wanted to get Pistol Pete's autographed. So Pete and him had just finished practice. They watched the practice and all. He's up in the showers, and it was all open showers. The Hawks dressed in one of the dressing rooms. I think it later became the women's dressing room when they started women's sports. It was their dressing room, and we were across the hall in our locker rooms. But Pete was in the shower when we went up, and my brothers had their pen in their program, and I yelled at Pete, will you come sign some autographs for my brothers? He walks out of the shower, dripping wet, buck naked, and signed their autographs. And no problem. Everybody still have those autographs, but that was the kind of atmosphere it was. So that was a feature that probably we might have violated an NCAA regulation or two, but it was well worth going to Georgia Tech and going through that experience there. Now, we'll get around to maybe basketball in a few minutes, but the experience was, and the challenge was, we had about 25 people on scholarship. There were no limits to scholarships back then. Coach Hyder would have three. He had a freshman, of course. That could be anywhere. I had there were three freshmen on my recruiting year, but there was 12 on some years after me.
Oh, my goodness.
They'd play up in the freshman team, Jim. He had it set up so you had 3 colors of pullover mesh jerseys. And of course, we had practice white T-shirts, but your starters would have the practice white T-shirts. The second team to scrimmage or to work against each other would have gold pullovers. And the third team, which was the last, what you might call the third 5, would have green pullovers. And the green team was you call them the scout or the scrub team. They'd have to go up and scrub or practice against the freshman team, which they had their own schedule and coach. The gold and white teams would be on the floor down in Alexander McCamish. So the goal was, and that was your traveling team downstairs. So what motivated players back then was to get on the traveling team. And he might dress a couple more out for home games, but he only traveled with 10, maybe 11 players, 3 years. So that motivated you to try to make the traveling team. Well, my sophomore year, again, my rookie year as a guard, really, because I played forward on the freshman team. We had 3 for scholarship and 9 walk-ons or something like that. One of the walk-ons was a high school All-American, Randy Jones, who about 5'8" or 9. But he was a great ball player, but he wasn't on scholarship. His son now is the associate athletic director at Georgia Tech. I forget his first name, but last name's Jones.
I have a question. How does... Well, this may be too off topic, but I was just curious. You said he was a high school All-American, but he was a walk-on, and I'm like, well, how does that happen? But then you said his height, and that may have had something to do with it.
He was not a Muggsy Bogues sort of a 5'9" guy. He could handle the ball very well. He played on the North All-Star team, and they had full court press us during the All-Star game. And it was easy to get by him, pretty easy. But he was, the Atlanta schools got advantage on all the recognized teams just because you had the newspaper there and you had one All-American magazine was Scholastic Coach, I believe it was called. And that the starter and owner of that magazine was actually a basketball coach during the wartime named Dwight Keith.
And coached at Tech. I think he was. I think Roy MacArthur was in between them, but he was.
Yeah.
He coached before Hyder did. So yeah.
He did. There was one. He coached while everybody was off at the war, basically 43, 44, 45 time frame. He was a high school coach in Atlanta, and they needed somebody to coach because then if you got called up, you went to the war, like in the 1944 team, sent off about half the team got drafted right before the SEC tournament. So they were a little bit short players there, but they had to go into active duty and went off to they went to D-Day, and one of them actually got killed there. They played on the team that year. So that was a tough time for athletics everywhere. And most of our teams, football and basketball, were they call it the V12 program, where you come to Tech and become an officer when you leave, whenever it was time to leave, but you had technical engineering experience or whatever. So a lot of the players in Georgia Tech's greatness in those years were from people that came in and from the service and played the sports. And when you get on down to the composition of a freshman team, you just had to play what you had, what came. And but when I got to that varsity, I just remembered what Coach Hyder always told me when he signed me. He says, "You're going to have a role to play, and you'll play if you do that role." And I did. I was not the starter. I think I got to start one game,
And your sophomore year was 69-70?
69-70, yeah. That was our first NIT year.
First of the two back-to-back.
Yeah.
And so that was, I think y'all won 17 and lost 10, I believe.
Yeah, we went into the NIT at 16-9. I think we beat Duquesne or somebody the first game, and played St. John's the second game. That was I'd say that's my most enjoyable year of playing basketball, because first of all, I think my third or fourth game, we played UCLA out there in a Christmas tournament in Pauley Pavilion.
Oh, man. And this is back when they were dominating the whole sport.
They were just killing it. They beat us 131-90.
Oh, my goodness. Who was on that team?
Pardon me?
Who was on that UCLA team?
The weakest one was Steve Patterson, the center. They had Henry Bibby and as a guard. They had Curtis Rowe and Sidney Wicks as the two wing forwards. And the second guard was played for the Hawks a few years. But they had all five of those players were drafted.
Oh, my goodness.
And Coach, of course, the story of coaches, how their demeanor was in those days, they kind of learned from when they played how a coach should act. And until 1948, coaches were not allowed to talk to players even at timeout during the game. They couldn't coach from the bench. They couldn't speak to the players. Players had to be prepared to play when they come out on the court. There was no intervention from the coaches. The team captain had to talk to the referees and run the teams pretty much on the court.
Oh, man.
That was a difference. Now, if you take Coach Hyder and Coach Wooden, who they played for, kind of a second, if Naismith was a first-generation coach, and the rules still applied till 1948, they were going to be like their coaches on the bench. And Coach Hyder hardly ever stood up. He never yelled. He never waved his arms and tried to change something during a play. Actually, as a point guard, I had to learn to call the plays coming down the court, and you'd hold up my language was a little problem because it took me too long to say the number one, because the play already needed to be started by then. So I held up one. Okay. And then we go into whatever that was. It could have been we had names for our plays. It could have been the California. It could be the Kentucky. It could be most of them were like shuffle movements, hike offenses. It could be the flip-flop. So we were changing offenses, not from the coach's direction, but from the point guard or the player's directions.
So UCLA,
and the same with defenses.
Sorry. So UCLA beat y'all, and then later that year you play a tournament, I think in Charlotte. And I think they beat.
Yeah, that was January. Might have been early February. The Charlotte Invitational Tournament. We were not ACC, but it was normally an ACC tournament only. It would be Clemson, North Carolina State, and South Carolina. Well, that year, a year before, and Homer Rice was the athletic director then, when South Carolina pulled out of the ACC. And they pulled out, according to what Homer told me, or we kind of knew it, was that the ACC would not drop their standards for becoming a athlete at ACC school, which was 800 SAT. And South Carolina wanted less. They wanted, NCAA said 700. So they wanted to go SEC style, and they couldn't get in the SEC right away, and 10 years later maybe. But they wanted to get lesser academics into South Carolina. So they pulled out of the ACC. Homer needed somebody to come in to fill their gap. So Homer and Bobby Dodd were close even back then. So Homer calls Bobby Dodd and said, I don't know if he knew he probably knew of Wackeider, probably did. But anyway, Wack said, yeah, we'd love to go do it. So they invited us in, and nobody knew that much about us, and it's probably how we could beat North Carolina State. I think they were number 5 at the time, and UNC, they were number 8 or 9, 10 maybe. We beat them back-to-back on a Friday and Saturday night. and like Roger Kaiser's team, and Roger really brought this jump shot into Georgia Tech. As one of those Indiana things, and Southern people still shooting two-hand set shots. But he kind of brought it in the early 60s. And his was a big turning point those years. We got into they got into the NCAA
Yep.
in 1960.
And then
and there's a story behind that, too. But
y'all beating those two teams in 2 days sort of... Right, well,
that was the next turning point.
Yeah. And then also, Youngkus scored 47, I believe, in one of those games.
He did it in the first game against NC State.
And that put him on the map nationally.
That did. That actually put the team and him on the map. And when we started from that point on, after a lot of publications you may have seen, we were in the headlines, UCLA this, Georgia Tech that, and that was really national recognition that really wasn't there before. Then that led to national level recruiting and, of course, everything else that goes along with that. So that made us arch enemies then of every ACC team, and particularly North Carolina that we played. So and we took some beatings from them, and then we, of course, beat them a couple of times. But we had a pretty heavy ACC schedule then with Clemson, North Carolina State. Of course, we played Florida State, but they weren't in then. It's just, if we look back, and if I counted up the ACC records back then, they were not too bad. But then from there on, it was like, who are these guys? And then we started winning pretty much the rest of the games. And you could get into, of course, there's only 25 teams invited to play in the NCAA tournament, and 16 in the NIT. So we knew what we were up against if we went to the NCAA when it was time to be selected or pick one. We were invited to both 1970 ending season and the 71 to the NCAA, because the 71 season was a 23 and it was a 20 and something record. It was a legitimate.
71 was the big year, and we'll get into that in a minute.
Yeah. So go back to the 70 year. We were the underdogs. Well, we actually sat in our locker room with gray lockers and no carpet on the floor and a wooden bench and a hamper to throw your gym clothes in when you finish to get them back the next day, and the old dial locks on your locker and stick your Chuck Taylors in. I mean, we didn't care much about fancy locker rooms and all that. That was better than what we had in high school usually. So we voted, sitting there. Coach handed us a 3-5 card and says, we got 2 invitations here, one to the NCAA and one to the NIT. And he was actually on the selection committee for the NCAA. He says, I'll do what you guys want to do. And he gave us all a pencil and a card. He says, it's an anonymous vote. You never tell who voted for what, but I want you to write it on the card and fold it up and put it in this hat. And we did. And then a few minutes later, he came back in and said, we're going to the NIT. And our thinking was, we talked about it a little bit while he was gone. He says, if we go to the NCAA, we're going to somewhere come up against UCLA again. And we know they can kick our butts. We'll have to, if we went to the, we'd be an independent, and we'd have to go somewhere besides the southeast region. And where we would have gone was to Dayton, Ohio. So it didn't take us long to figure out, well, we want to go to Dayton for one game or two on a college campus, or we want to go to New York City and stay as long as we can in the big city in the Madison Square Garden.
And that was back when, MSG, well, it was the fourth iteration of MSG, but it was but it was relatively new. I know that the current one is built in the late 60s, and of course, it's New York, and that was back when...
It was the late 60s when it's the one that's there now.
And this was back when, the NIT wasn't recognized as the official championship, but it was still, held in pretty high regard, and so that how was going to New York City? That must, of course, you would. I'm guessing at this point you've kind of gotten acclimated to Atlanta, but Atlanta and New York. Atlanta's a city, but New York is something else. And I've visited there twice, and it's crazy. And I don't mean that in a bad way.
I think there's an article in the Atlanta paper you could read about it where we went up, and I forget who the writer was that went up with us, but we had a sports writer that attended with us, and he kind of did an article about us arriving in New York City, and everybody talked about it. Rick Junker says, "This is what I always wanted to do is play in the NIT in Madison Square Garden." And Pete Maravich said the same thing to the press in other articles. But that was the big place to go. And the article was, everybody talked about it a little bit. And I was the only player actually on the team from Georgia at that time on the traveling squad. When it got around, what they quoted me as saying is, we looked at, I think it was Macy's or some large department store that was like forever tall and forever long, and I said, the paper quoted me and says, "Hey, that building's bigger than all of Wiggum." and it made the papers. I don't remember saying it, but I must have. But anyway, it was that kind of a atmosphere, and we'd go up to the top of the Empire State Building. The Twin Towers weren't there then. That was the tallest building in town. So they gave us tours. The whole city kind of turned out to us. So we had dinners and Mama Leone's, which is the most famous Italian restaurant there. We had some fans up there. Remember the name Red Baron, if you remember that name, of early Georgia Tech. His brother was a big movie producer in New York City, and they put us up, take us to places, and it was just what we expected it to be. Joe Namath, we met him some place up there. I mean, it was like the whole town turns out for the NIT guest. And we wouldn't have found that in Dayton, Ohio, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely not.
So we upset Duquesne, who was ranked in the top, 15 or 20 in the country. But nobody could get into the NCAA unless you won your conference tournament. and we didn't have a conference, so we were going to be an independent at-large bid anyway. And we had the likes of Jacksonville, Marquette, and a few other big-name independents at the time, Notre Dame. And but we were lucky to get invited to the NCAA because they only invited 4, I think, independents. And then we were one of the top 4 picks to the NIT that first year, 1970.
And so you must have known, okay, actually, I don't know if they were even seeded back then, but you must have known that since you were a top 4 or whatever it was.
Yeah, we had a good chance. And we did. We played Duquesne, beat them by 8 or 10 points. They call that an upset.
And then you played St. John's.
People knew about us, but that was a north or northeastern team.
You played St. John's, and you're playing them at the Garden, so you're basically playing a road game.
We're playing on their home court, and their referees, and their fans. We might have had 50 fans there. But in that game, had some leads. I think it led at halftime. We had 3 or 4 point lead near the end. And it got down to, we were 1 point ahead with a minute to go or less. And I think it got tied up. Back in those days, you shoot, if you got fouled after a certain, I guess if you got fouled non-shooting, you got a 1 point shot. So a lot of times your stats will say you shoot free throws, you'd have a 1 for 1 there or something. But something happened where the game got tied up. And Coach Heider, he never complained about referees. He was a gentleman. He wouldn't complain. But in the New York Times, reporters asked him about the referees. He lowered the boom on them. He called out 3 calls in the last minute. They were bad calls. And one was a St. John's player jumping in front of Jim Thorne on a driving layup. No, you can't move in somebody when he's in the air and get a charge. It was a charge. Another one where the guy ran on the end line, and you couldn't run across the court, in the end zone. Then it was against the rules. You had to be still. But he was running, trying to beat our press, and that wasn't called. The third one, I made the headlines because I was blamed for having an intentional foul when the game was tied. And Coach said, well, nobody does an intentional foul. And of course, that gave him points and the free throws and the ball. Nobody does that when the game is tied. He made a point. I mean, I fouled the guy, but it wasn't intentional. It should have been a 1 point shot or something like that. But they put my name in the paper. I was called the GOAT after that by teammates and in the newspaper in Atlanta. And that wasn't the greatest of all time. That was the old scapegoat thing.
Yeah.
So I had that handled until somebody changed it to the greatest of all times. Everybody thinks, okay. But it was that game we lost by 1 point. And they did. We had 1 point ahead till, I think, in our offense, the guard would have to go a lot of times inside, and you'd be out of your guard position many times because of the shuffle type of offenses we ran. You'd be down setting a screen, rolling the basket, or whatever. But the other guard didn't get back on defense when I did one of those shuffle, pass off to the wing, cut to the middle, or whatever. And they scored a long pass at the last second or two. They got the ball beyond our other guard, and they made a layup and won the game because we were ahead by 1. But that was those calls at the end made it really look like a home job. And you see in the articles that it was a home job, and then of course they went on and played Army or somebody next and got beat. But that was Coach. He went on to coach the Nets after that. That was his last home game.
Carnesecca.
Yeah, Carnesecca.
And then he later came back.
Yeah, they thought they could win the NIT his last year. But they met Marquette in the finals, and Dean Miminger beat them pretty easily. But that was the number 18 team in the country there at NIT.
And Al McGuire was their coach, and what a coach and character he was. He was the reason that they put the McGuire rule in 2 years later, and we were part of the reason because we were invited to the NCAA and chose the NIT, but they called it the Al McGuire rule. Said if you're invited to the NCAA, you're not eligible for the NIT as a member of the NCAA. Yep.
And then that started the downfall of the NIT. Yes. And then NIT sued the NCAA, and that went on for about 10 years. In 1985-ish, NCAA bought out the NIT, and that ended the NIT as a good tournament for sure.
Yeah.
And they don't even play at the Madison Square Garden anymore.
Yeah, that they moved it a couple years. Well, at first they made it to where most of the games were on campus besides the Final Four, and then they moved, and then their lease ended and they couldn't continue it, and it's lost most of its luster. But back then it was, a relatively big deal. So you have that heartbreaking loss to St. John's, but Rich Youngkus is returning for his senior year, and the next year they, sort of built on what you had done the year prior, and they had an even better season. Although they didn't, from what I recall looking at, they didn't have any signature wins like they had the year before, but they did have Rich Youngkus, and he was playing well, and they won most of their games. Y'all played Hawaii at Hawaii, and I think he played them twice. And they weren't really. They had either just joined Division I or whatever it was, or had just made that step up, and they were just starting out. And I think y'all split with them, but that must have been a fun trip to go out there.
It was a fun trip. We had too much fun. The reason we should have beaten them. They had Bob Nash, who became a very good professional player. They did get invited to the NIT in '70 for the '72 NIT, '71 NIT. They had we should have beaten them. The reason we were a little bit not our normal selves was Coach let us go to the beach in Waikiki. We stayed right outside off the beach there. He said, y'all going out and enjoy the beach. Well, this was February in Atlanta, and we were as white as a piece of paper. And we went out and enjoyed the beach for about 45 minutes. And everybody come back sunburned. And we couldn't even put our uniforms on hardly because of being like lobsters when we came off the beach after 45 minutes. So we, of course, alloyed ourselves down, so to speak, and went and played. But they were a good team that year. And little that people know, but Rick Pitino was the assistant coach of Hawaii that year.
And that's fascinating, And
well, let me back that up. No, he wasn't. Red Rocha was still the head coach. My first, if you want to, I'll tell the story about Rick Pitino and me out there. But they were good. They beat us. We were not ourselves. We were hurting before the game, but they had a good team. They beat us twice.
So later, you go to the NIT again, and Youngkus was, I believe Youngkus. I mean, he had the scoring record at Tech, and his number was retired. Was he an All-American? Yep. I believe he was.
Pardon me? Did what?
Was Youngkus an All-American in '71?
Yeah. He was probably harder to guess, academic All-American for 2 years, but he was a second-team All-American in '71. He was the sixth, I think, leading scorer in the country, and but he went up there and he had an ankle injury, and that hampered him a little bit.
But you got through most of the competition. You got Well, who'd you play? I forget who they played in the first couple rounds of that 71.
We played LaSalle, I believe. We played St. Bonaventure and Michigan. First 3 rounds.
And then that got them to a rematch from the team that they had beaten the year prior, North Carolina.
Yeah. Their mission, I think, in life was to beat us every time they played us after that. But that was Dean Smith coaching. He finished regular season ACC champions. They lost by, I think, 2 points in the tournament. They were ranked like number 3 or 4 in the country. But he couldn't go to the NCAA because they only took tournament champions of the 25 invites. So he went up there with the intention of, obviously, with a chip on his shoulder of winning that. And they beat us maybe 12, 14 points. But that was probably Youngkus' worst game of the 4 there. And he still got 15 points and maybe 10 rebounds. But they were it was like when Rich was his best year was his junior year. He averaged 30 points a game, and like 12 rebounds and 54% from shooting.
Goodness
He put a target on his back. He hardly ever got single teamed from then on. And
that put a
every
big workload
on him. One-on-one, he would beat Artis Gilmore. He beat him, even though they beat us 5 at home right before we went to the NIT. But he could handle anybody one-on-one. When they put 2 on him, it slowed him down a little bit. And Dean Smith was a good enough coach that he figured out how to take our inside game away. And we weren't, I mean, the guards, like we played UCLA, their 2 guards, John Vallely was the other one. They had 23 and 25 points each. Every guard we had didn't even have a total of 15 points. And I had a third of those. I'd play behind a good player, coach's son out of New York, John Verriser. His brother was Tommy Verriser, the baseball pitcher for the Mets for a long time. But John was a good defensive player, good point guard or good guard for WAC. He would get the ball inside. He was a bit slow, and he'd foul out about halftime of every game. So I was his backup. So I got to play a lot because of John. And actually, my point per game was a little bit more than his points per game, even though he started. But neither one of us had 3 points a game that year. So we were not a guard-oriented offense. We were a inside game offense, and that was Rich Yonkers. And we had some good forwards. They could shoot 15, 20 feet out, and good, strong players. We had Bill Mayer, a junior college transfer out of New York, out of L.A. His scoring percentage at Georgia Tech was 64%. He may still have that, unless John Sally beat him. But he was a tough 6'5" forward that was muscle you had to gym. So we had enough players besides Rich to win most games. But if it wasn't Rich at his game, we had trouble. And that's how the ending of the NIT that year was.
And then that sort of was a foreshadow for what would happen your senior year.
No, it was a nightmare shadow. We all knew it, too. The coach knew it. He had 3 guys on our year, but I think they were overconfident and didn't think 2 years ahead on our scholarship of our year. And the center he had brought in, his summer of high school year, he fell off of a 5-story building and didn't kill himself, but it did cripple him a little bit, but he came on in and played pretty good anyway. But we just didn't have a backup center. So the next year, 5-20 or 5-22 or something like that, we go from on top to on bottom, so to speak. I can feel for the best of Georgia Tech's teams, how the players and coaches may have felt. I can feel for the worst of Georgia Tech's teams, how the players and coach felt. I have empathy for both. But we played everybody we did the years before. They remember the years before. Florida State, we beat them down there, stopped their 29-game home streak the year before. They beat us 58 points my senior year.
Goodness gracious.
We were humbled. But we didn't quit trying. But we just and we beat Georgia in the last game of the year. That was what made us a good year.
Didn't they do that 2 years in a row as well?
They beat them the next year, which was the fighting year.
Yeah, the big brawl in Wax last game.
So we never gave it up. We hustled as hard as we could.
Wasn't there, I forget his name, but, they had, not to say that they hadn't tried, it's just, they, unfortunately, the environment, the state of Georgia, but I think the first African-American basketball player played your senior year. I forget his name.
Carl Benz. Carl was a junior college transfer, graduate from Stuart McConnell up in North Georgia. And he was about 6'9", a little bit heavy, 250 pounds or something, a bit slow. He just wasn't the Rich Yonkers. He might have averaged 8-9 points a game.
And then I think he transferred out to Morris Brown afterwards, I know.
He did. The academics got to him. he was not our first black player at Georgia Tech. We had Harvey Webb on the 67 freshman team that played with Yonkers and Thorne. But he also had to transfer out due to grades or something. Not bad grades, but he wasn't on scholarship, and I think his mom said, "Let's go over to the Morris Brown or somewhere," and finished up. And he became an executive higher up in the U.S. Treasury Department in Atlanta, and Carl went on to be a PhD in faculty at the University of Maryland, so they both did very well. But they weren't the basketball players that they started getting a little bit later on in African American players.
Well, so
and the game changed too. Early 70s was the beginning of everybody integrating.
Yes, and Tech was, I won't say Tech was behind, but just being in the state of Georgia, sort of made it difficult. If Bobby Dodd could, he probably would have done it in the late 50s, but they just weren't ready yet.
Let's go back to the 1960 NCAA participation. Went to the Elite Eight, and it wasn't like a 68 and 32 and 16. It was 25, and you broke it on down.
Are you going to talk about? So, I believe what you're going to say. I think I know what you're going to talk about. Wasn't Tech second, and I think Auburn was first in the SEC?
Auburn was first.
And they said no or weren't able to because of segregation in Alabama or whatever.
Well, you hear it from two different publications. I think it was probably, let's say, the Atlanta newspaper, or let's say the biographies of the players at the time. Anyway, one would say it was because of a small violation, NCAA, a violation of the football team for getting jerseys or something they weren't supposed to get, or shoes. That was what Auburn would say. Now, the black publications of the day would say it's because the basketball coach and athletic director at Auburn did not want to go play against black athletes. And I tend to believe that's probably more the truth.
Maybe. And wasn't it Joel Eves, I think?
Yes. And, of course, as the athletic director of Georgia, his first black player was in 1971, who was, I played against him my junior year. And he was the first black athlete at Georgia, not football or anything else. So they were, that was typical of the South. Florida State had black players a little bit ahead of everybody. Georgia Southern did, as far as the Puerto Regent school in Georgia, but not Georgia Tech and not Georgia.
So after your playing days, your college days, you graduated, you coached a little bit. Could you tell us about that? You weren't a head coach, but you did some coaching.
Well, I'll correct the record there. It's a long story short. I did go in the Army. I was ROTC in Georgia Tech to avoid being drafted because we had the lottery system then, and I was a low number, and I would have been drafted if I hadn't have graduated in 4 years, or if I didn't choose ROTC. So I graduated in the 4 years. I chose ROTC. Most everybody else with a high draft number or high lottery number did not stay in ROTC. It was required the first 2 years anyway. But, because all those guys had 300s. Your birthday gave you a day of the year that your number was. And 365 was the best one to get, of course. I had number 96. Yonkers had, I remember all these. Yonkers had like 230. Thorne had 300 something. I was the only one that was below 100. They always took more than 100 every year to go into the Army and go to Vietnam normally. So I came out as a second lieutenant. Had orders to Vietnam for spring of 72 or 3. Graduated in 72, went to the schools. But they canceled the shipments of people to Vietnam in February of 73. My orders were changed to the 25th Infantry Division in Hawaii. And this is where the Rick Pitino story comes in. So Rick was out there, finished Providence. He went out to be an assistant, maybe a graduate assistant coach at the University of Hawaii for Coach O'Neill was his name. So Rick and I, and he was a City League player. And in my free time, I could play pickup games and City League games. So Rick and I played pickup games at least. He was on a different City League team. But we played ball together, both 23 years old. I think he was a year younger than me. But he became the assistant coach out there. And then that had just become an NCAA Division I team about 2 years ago. Well, in 1970, I think was their first year, and they went to the NIT. But they were always recruiting, freelance recruiting, and this, that, and the other. It was a habit out there. They could give flights back to the U.S. for the kids, and weren't supposed to be doing that, to go home for Christmas or whatever. But Rick, he and his head coach got reprimanded or for violations by the NCAA. The head coach was fired. Rick left and went on to I think Boston University or somewhere. But that was the beginning of his coaching days, right there when they got put on probation. But I'm sure he doesn't tell that story a lot either, but I was there, sort of thing. And he's a good guy. I liked him. I like him still.
Well, I respect Lowell. I grew up with him at Louisville. I did, yeah, and that was my introduction to him. And then there was that huge scandal that happened there, and I'm not going to blame him for it because I don't know how much of that was directly him. But then that sort of made me perceive him one way. But then then he comes back to St. John's, and what he has done, it does impress me to do it at that age, and also to adapt to the new sort of system of college athletics, and to not only adapt but to succeed and to win. Well, and then also when St. John's hired him, I'm like, that's a perfect fit. I'm like,
he's back home.
Yeah, he fits there like a glove.
He's a Lou Carnesecca. He's home. He'll win there in the Garden. So yeah, he's loving it. I respect that. He stuck it out. As long as I think he's probably going to retire from there. I'm pretty sure. But he was of that next generation of players. When I said the generations changed, when the Bobby Knights came out of college and then went into coaching and all, that was that next generation. The Tarkanians of the world, but they had more free reign to be more liberal in their practices than it was before, and the tradition of the coaches' trees, the branches were more traditional as it was from the invention of basketball through about 3 generations. But then you started having the UNLVs with the run and gun offense, as we called it. You started having NCAA was putting out rules, and then their coaches are trying their best to not get caught violating them. And a lot of them did, some of them didn't. maybe some of them got caught, and a lot of them didn't. But even rumors of John Wooden having some irregularities. But if you get in the right atmosphere, you don't know what your players are doing. If you're in a big-time atmosphere with a lot of floating money around and your donors, and Wooden would have probably never known some of the things that he's been accused of, not officially, but of getting players. But he did have a knack for getting players from the East that wanted to get out of the East, I think, or the South.
Yeah.
Henry Bibby, for one. Henry, everybody remembers Mike Bibby, of course, played at Arizona, and that's Damon's time frame. But Henry was a North Carolina kid, small town, and his high school principal sent John Wooden a letter and said, "I got this kid here. He was in actually a segregated school. They still segregated in 60s and 70s and down south. But nobody had ever heard of him. He was a top player in the States. But he couldn't get into an ACC school because he didn't have an 800 SAT. He got B school, B average in school, but when you took the test, it didn't reflect him having an 800 score. So his principal sent him Wooden a note. I read it in one of the biographies, either somewhere I read that. I didn't know that personally. But he said, yeah, I'd like to watch him play or have somebody see him play. And Wooden was, he'd come to Campbell College in North Carolina to do summer camps. Now, why, I don't know, but that's a private university. It's been around a couple hundred years, it seems. But he would come there, and that was his recruiting in the East or Southeast, Mid-East. So he had a coach there, or a guy that went over and saw Henry play in high school and said, yeah, you need to get this guy. So he invites Henry out to visit. Happened to be the Final Four in Los Angeles that year. And he sets Henry up for going to the Final Four and being taken around town by the elites of Hollywood. And Henry decided to go there. Same happened with something similar happened with Kareem.
L.A.'s L.A. I mean, that's just
Yeah.
That's a good place to have a program where you want to recruit talent, because it's Los Angeles.
And it was like Atlanta to me. It was big time.
I mean, it's Atlanta, but with the palm trees and the best weather on earth. I mean, it's
and the women and everything. Yeah. But yeah.
So back to what I was asking you about after and I should have mentioned the military stuff first, because I got out of the way.
I wasn't thinking I was going to stay in the military very long anyway. I had about a 5-year commitment. But out of Hawaii, I went from active duty, voluntarily left active duty to go into the reserves, because I did always want to coach. So I got a call from he was the head coach at Georgia Southern through 41 years of coaching. A guy named J.B. Skeers, still the winningest coach in Georgia of all colleges. He called me because he remembered trying to recruit me in high school. He says, I was told by one of our friends who was an athletic director at Augusta College at the time, Marvin Vanover. He says, I understand you're getting out. You want to coach? And I said, yeah, I'd like to do that. And he said, well, I want you to come be my assistant coach, because my athletic director, good friend, asked me to come back out of retirement after 10 years. And JB was he signed the first black player in the state of Georgia in the Board of Regents School of Georgia, and gave him a scholarship, named Roger Brown. Well, Roger went on to play pro ball, but JB recruited him, but then he, that next year, he retired from coaching and went and got his doctorate degree to come back to be a dean of the school or whatever. JB asked me if I'd help him. I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. I went down to Georgia Southern, Statesboro, and he had never coached a black player, but he had 10 years earlier had recruited him, signed him. And he says, he pulled me into the office and said, hey, I have never coached these guys like these before. Would you help me? Of course, I had, being around black players and growing up with black players on the farm. That's all you had as neighbors usually. I had no problem with any of that. And I understood where they were coming from. Military, of course, integrated. And it became very stark to me on our first road trip. And of course, we went in vans. I drove one, he drove the other. But I started seeing white smoke coming out of the windows of the van he was driving. I got ahead of him, waved him down, and stopped. And I said, Coach, why don't you go sit in my van for a minute? And he says, why? I said, I want to talk to these players. they were smoking pot and blowing it out the windows. This is 1977. And I said, boys, I didn't say boys, I said, young men, I know what you're doing. I've seen it before. In Hawaii, everybody smoked pot. I didn't because the military kicked you out. But it was a big thing in Hawaii at the time. And you cannot stay eligible, and NCAA will kick you out of school, and school would too, if you get caught doing this. So from this day forward, you don't do it. And you don't do it on Coach Scaris's bus. And they all took me up on that. They knew I knew them and how they were going to be. So that was, but he gave me the responsibilities of coaching, both practice, floor practice, and coaching games. And he had 41 years by that time of coaching. And he was in his 60s, late 60s. And he was, but he trusted me enough because he knew the coaches at Georgia Tech, and he knew, but no problem with me doing that. And one thing I remember about those days was we'd play, Georgia Southern was I forget, there might have been the same conference or something as Appalachian State. I forget what it was called. But we played in a tournament against Appalachian State. And that was Bobby Cremins' third year at Appalachian State. And he had some good success. But and Coach Hyder, of course, he sits on the bench and he's relaxing, watching the game, and I'm doing all the coaching stuff. And Bobby probably didn't even know this, that I was an assistant coach of who I was, and because we never played South Carolina. But we beat Bobby, and Georgia Southern beat Bobby, and they put it in the papers. So yeah, they tore us up. So I go back to Bobby and I say, Bobby, you're 0-1 against me in coaching, and he had a little trouble with that. I said, yeah, I was the assistant coach at Georgia Southern in your third year at Appalachian. Yeah, I remember that game. That I was shooting my players out, and we didn't lose very many after that. But
what did you think? What did you think when we hired him? Well, first let me explain to listeners.
Yeah.
Tech had basically, if you think that the current situation is bad, I don't think you can scratch the surface of fathoming how bad the 1980-81 Tech basketball team was. It was just a deplorable situation. They came to the ACC and they just got punched in the mouth.
I can tell you why. The why is, of course, Dwayne Morrison. He was a 10-year, 64, almost a 10-year assistant coach for Coach Hyder. He did all the recruiting. He never sat on the bench in games. You never see his face on the bench during a game, but he was always out recruiting. Very good recruiter. And he was actually, Coach Hyder hired him because Coach Hyder's first game as a coach was against South Carolina, and Dwayne was playing on that team. He was an All-South player, maybe some stage of All-American player on that team, South Carolina. And Coach remembered him, and Dwayne was like an all-Army player in the Army, because everybody went in the Army in those days. And Dwayne actually coached a couple of games at South Carolina when the head coach couldn't or left or something. But he remembered him as a stand-up guy, and he hired him as his assistant. Dwayne and Wack didn't have an assistant for 3 years when he started, and then he got Byron Gilbert his fourth year, and then Dwayne his second assistant, like his fifth or sixth year. But he liked Dwayne. Dwayne was a very good coach. He taught you how to be tough on the court. He said, if you're going to foul somebody, make that person go the line cross-eyed. I mean, he was that kind of a player, and he was that kind of a coach.
And he was at Mercer, I believe. He left Tech as an assistant and then went to Mercer or some smaller school.
The rest of the story, and we had some good opportunities to hire different people, Roger Kaiser included, but they wanted Bobby Dayton Whitehider wanted him to come back to be the head coach, and that was already preordained. But he needed some head coaching experience. So Mercer was an NAIA school, maybe Division I or II, I don't remember. But he went down as the head coach. He turned the program around, or elevated it. I wouldn't say around, but he got him, and he was the first Division I coach there and did well. Then, of course, Whitehider retired in 1973, and Dwayne came in. And there was coaches around like Roger, who had won 4 national championships by then in NAIA Division II. And he was asked by, I think, Bobby Dodd or White, hey, don't apply. don't even waste your time. And he didn't, because Dwayne was coming back, and he was to take the teams, which some he had recruited, and some Butch Clifton came in for that 1 year, or 2 years actually, 71 and 72 as the assistant. But he had never coached college before. He was a high school coach out of Macon. And he just was a filler there. But Dwayne came in, and his players, those that he recruited played for him. Those that it didn't, he didn't recruit, didn't play well for him. And I think it was a level of toughness that he instilled that maybe Coach Hyder wasn't instilled. He would never told you to be a tough player, but he expected you to be. And Dwayne would show you how to be. and such if you weren't. But those level of players, 73, 4, 5, and then he started getting some assistants in that could bring in some players that weren't necessarily qualified for academics at Georgia Tech, but Sammy Drummer was one out of Mercy, Indiana. They came in and had to put them over in junior college to get them eligible or something. But they came in and they were good players.
Tico Brown, I think.
Tico Brown, yeah. They had about a threesome there that could play independent and they could play Metro. But those two leagues were below the ACC level.
And the ACC at this time, it had been 8 teams, and then South Carolina left, and it was 7 teams, but it was 7 really good teams. It was by far the toughest comp, because the Big East was just starting out, and so while the Big East was good, it wasn't until the mid-'80s, when the Big East would kind of dethrone the ACC. So
and the SEC was terrible after Kentucky. They were, so your best players went to the ACC. Let's put it that way, and they from all over the country. So he had the hardest coaching job I know of anybody at Tech, and he had to transition them through three pretty competitive, even independents were competitive still back then, to get into any tournament. And then it was like a tsunami hitting you when they got into the ACC. And he was asked to leave. He wasn't fired or anything, and he understood it. So he got out of coaching and went to be a golf caddy.
And he's still alive, I think.
Pardon me?
Dwayne is still alive, I think.
Yeah, he is. He lives up in Chattanooga, I think, somewhere in Tennessee. One of our former players, Toby Niderfer, keeps up with him. And Jay Niderfer is his dad, who passed away recently. But, he's still there. He came back for the christening of the McCamish, and that's the last time I saw him.
Well, that's good.
But he's well respected.
So he leaves, and I've heard. Well, first there was a rumor going around, and I don't even know how true it was because Homer Rice denied it in the papers. But first, the rumor was that we're trying to get Terry Holland at Virginia, which I that would have been nuts if they had been able to pull it off. Of course, they couldn't, but they asked a lot of people, and a lot of people said no because, of course, the situation was just not great. And so then they get to Crimmins, and he comes in. that rebuild must have been exciting. And my dad went to school at Tech from 85 to 89 when and by then they had really gotten going. And Crimmins just really made it a national program. And the reason why so many fans are upset is because the standard was raised when the Crimmins got there. And he really sort of, of course, Hyder had put the program on the map decently, but for a whole new generation, Crimmins took what Hyder did and then raised the bar even more.
Yeah, he was, the details, and Bobby and I are friends, close friends, I would say. He always checked on me when I had my cancer and things like that, and I check on him with his health problems, and just a good guy all around, privately as well as publicly. But he, and I got to know Coach Rice, Homer, very well in the last 10 years of his life. He asked me to do some research for his family tree. He was trying to and put it down on paper to show his entire career, where they came from, where they settled. Found out he's actually my 10th cousin or something in the family tree, but because he wanted to leave a legacy, not public, not newspaper sort of things, but leave it to his family so they'll, next generation, grandkids and all, would know who he was. So it took me about 2 or 3 months and maybe 100 pages of printed out material to present him at his 95th birthday, his life story. And I'd already discovered some stuff when I was working with a letter winner military veterans recognition at Georgia Tech. That he was he volunteered for the Navy in 1944 as a 17-year-old to go in the Navy, because his high school member of the board of the high school. The high schools had their own boards back in those days, but a very well-liked person was killed a couple of years before. And that affected Homer because he's a good mentor for him. So he joined just as soon as he could. And he went to boot camp up in Illinois. And in his boot camp Homer was a baseball catcher and a football quarterback and played basketball too. But his catcher was a guy that was throwing 100-mile-an-hour pitches. I'll think of his name in a minute. But he was a catcher, and it was a pro catcher, pro pitcher, and all the pros went into the service as well. Some went to war, and some stayed back in the teaching side of it. And then Paul Brown was his football coach. And stretch that on out, Homer was Paul Brown's NFL coach in Cincinnati later on. So he met some good people there that helped him in his career. But so you got that all together and presented it to him. At his 95th birthday, he died at age 97 a couple years later. But besides what was published in the newspapers about him, he would talk. Of course, in the later years, his memory was still strong, but he just didn't have a lot of energy to be talking a lot and stuff. And his wife Karen would answer most of his mail. He had a lot of fan mail even coming from all over the country and internationally. People wanted to know about his leadership techniques and this, that, and the other. She was kind of his secretary in charge of not burdening him with all that. But he, maybe the story she told me was about the signing of Bobby. And Bobby was like, he was on a list, but he was down on the list. And I know the last guy to refuse the job was the University of Pennsylvania coach.
Oh, whose name escapes? The guy who took them to the Final Four.
Leiner or something like that.
Yeah.
I'd even applied to a job with him when I was. I coached 2 years at Georgia Southern, and then after that, Coach Scarce did retire again. They brought another assistant in that was taking over the program, and literally did. Even though Coach Scarce needed 3 years to get the higher retirement pay or something. So I went off to high school in Brunswick, Georgia, to be athletic director, basketball coach, and coach soccer and tennis, boys and girls. I mean, I did a lot of coaching. There's a private school at St. Simon's for 1 year, because I thought if I was going to be a college coach, I need to try to get into high school to start with, which got hired. Then my athletic director friend at Augusta College called me and said, "Would you like to come to Augusta College and be my assistant coach? Because I'm going to be just athletic director in a couple of years." And I said, "Sure." So I left that school after a year, and Davis Love was one of my golfers. That was a pretty good honor to teach. I didn't teach him any golf, but I told him how to be stronger, hit the ball harder. But I went on to Augusta College at the time. And women's coach quit, got married, and had to leave. Left the town to be with her husband. Coach asked me would I coach the women's team for 2 years. And I said, "Sure, I'd do that to get another coach in." So I coached women's basketball in the AIAW, which was the women's league, until right before they joined the NCAA. And that was a good experience. I enjoyed that. It was really good to teach and coach people who were really willing to learn and would do what the coach said and put all the effort into it. But anyway, the Army called me back in, so I came back in the Army in 1982 because I was on reserve time, and they needed active duty in my specialty, so I came back. And then 18 years later, I retired. But back to Homer's hiring of Bobby when coach from Penn. They could not work out a settlement. It might have been too much money or something, but it wasn't because Homer didn't want him. And that was three weeks after he talked to Bobby. So he called Bobby back and said, "Bobby, are you interested in the job?" And Bobby says, "Yes." Remember, Bobby just not too long before that got beaten by me in his low-level Division I program. But that was an opportunity Bobby wanted. And Homer said he hired him because Homer was, of course, AD in an ACC team, school, and he was, brought into Tech by Bobby Dodd, personally, wanted to be that. And he knew his budget, which was hardly anything. He knew he had to raise a lot of money. He knew he couldn't afford a big-time coach. But he saw in Bobby Crimmins a ferociousness to want to win in the ACC. Because Bobby's senior year, they were ranked number 3 in the country, and they lost the ACC tournament. Bobby's a year older than me. I guess it was 1970 or something.
I think 71.
Because they held the NIT at Columbia, the NCAA at Columbia as a regional, South Carolina. The rule was if you host a regional NCAA tournament, your team cannot participate in the NIT. And Bobby never got to play in a postseason tournament because they lost in the final game to I think, North Carolina State or somebody. So he had a vengeance for wanting to win in the ACC to pay him back. And he was a young guy.
He was part of that sort of young group that came in.
Yeah.
He, Krzyzewski, Valvano.
He was that next generation. Yeah, you got him and Coach K and Valvano. That was the generation after the Rick Pitino generation. And he said, he was so happy to have a shower in his office, he couldn't believe it. And he wanted $50,000 to come in. And Homer said, "You got it." He never signed a contract, never. So that was the agreement, a gentleman's agreement from two very good people.
And he
broke it.
He could recruit well, and he just helped this program take off. Now we're running low on time.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll just ask you, what do you the situation this year? People are split on Damon and if he should be kept another year, and then some people are like, well, he needs more funding and this and that. But my real thing is, there's talent there. They're just not playing well as a team. What do you think about the current situation?
I think the current circumstance is very unfortunate, not only from NCAA and court rules and regulations and the payment of players and the ability to easily transfer. All those things make it hard for anybody to win. And the chances were better to win in the ACC when the ACC was a lower level of play, which it has been in the last couple of years. This year it's not. Injuries, I'd like to have a debate with. I've actually never met personally Damon. I know of him. I know a lot about him. I know his background from published reports. I know where he came from. I know the type of players from which and families from which he came. I played against players in the late 60s, early 70s that were undergoing the same pressure that even he was undergoing in the 80s and late 80s and 90s, trying to break into the establishment, coming from a pretty rough background, not criminally, but just rough living. So I have empathy for him personally. I think he's in a very challenging situation. I think he's, like I have many times over, replayed my years of success and how they became about and how I was mentored and taught by good people. And I want to pass that formula on to current players as it was to me. But yet the environment is not what it used to be. And like I told the story of standing on the top of the Alexander Memorial Coliseum and Coach Hyder making an agreement with me to be able to finish college and play best of my abilities and play for the team. And I felt like I upheld my part of the agreement, and so did he. If I was in the athletic department today, and if I was the president of the school, and knowing the situation, I would say every year is going to be a rebuilding year. And I would look into the eyes of the person doing it, and look at his background, and look at the kind of players he may be having to recruit. I mean, I played on both sides of the racial thing. I played on an all-white high school, and I played with the first blacks that were integrated. And it took 10 more years even probably have where everybody was accepting black athletes and their backgrounds and their academics and everything else. And they have advantages physically and athletically because they probably had to do like I did. They probably had to go find a tree somewhere that was straight enough to put a backboard on and play on the dirt courts until they became very good at it. And that took lots and lots and lots of time and effort. I look around my neighborhood now, and I see basketball goals everywhere. I never see anybody using them, though. I see parks empty. But It's not that way in some neighborhoods, and that's where the players are coming from. So I think honoring the contract is the right thing to do. I think it's a tradition of Georgia Tech to do that. Mike Hyder had a 2-22 season within his first 2-3 years. If they'd have fired him then, we'd have probably never had a program. It'd be like MIT or somebody. Harvard, well, I wouldn't say Harvard there, but MIT or RPI or some of the technical schools. Because they had people there dedicated. They were people who believed in what Georgia Tech was academically and athletically. Now, Damon didn't have the opportunities to have gotten into an ACC school. He did make 800 on his SATs. He made the 700 on his second, maybe third try, I think maybe second try. So he could get into any school in the NCAA, and he did. So he understands, and I'd say him this face-to-face, you know how to play basketball, you know how to coach it. If things you're doing fundamentally are the same things I was coached all through my career. Maybe the athletes aren't as tough as they used to be, but several of them are. I've seen them play that way sometimes this year. The injuries, much more than they should be. What Damon did not get was the academic rigor of going to school, colleges, to learn some of the things that you might learn if you're a PE teacher or coach. I got my master's degree and a 6-year degree minus a dissertation in exercise physiology. I've developed strength programs, writing theses and dissertations on how not to get hurt. I taught Davis Love how to hit the golf ball 50 yards further on a strength training program. I was trained to go up and down the stairs of McCamish 10 times, pity patting after every practice to make my ankles and my feet stronger. I think Damon is being misled by the weightlifting generation of athletic trainers, not trainers, strength coaches, to where you've in a year-round program that just wears the players out so that when it comes tournament time, they had only maybe a weekend or two off during the last 9 months. They're worn out. Their bodies are going to be injured a lot easier. And if you train them, if you teach them to be tough by rolling the ball at mid-court, like Bobby Knight used to do, and say the first one that gets it gets to play, they're going to hurt themselves even trying to play. And I see that happen. To Bay this year, somebody ran in behind him and hurt his ankle or something, even our own teammates. So regulating how you train, giving people rest. I'm talking about time off, not pushing them harder when they're worn out from losing the game the night before. Those kind of things can be adjusted. But what you can adjust and find somebody that would understand the day's players probably more so than Damon can. And I've personally talked to some players that were there when he left, when he got there. They stuck with him. Kid that was from California, he said that's the best, hardest training he's ever gone through. He became a better player. But his attitude was, I want to play at Tech. I want to be here. My great grandfather was here. Gave a lot of money. Tennis center named after him. Homer's best friend. But that's the kind of spirit we need to recruit. Somebody that's willing and wanting, like Rich Uncas wanted to be an engineer. He became a manager. No problem. He couldn't have done both. But that's the kind of players we need.
I agree. We need guys who want to be here. Of course, unfortunately, this new era, some people, aren't going to be up to their word, but also, engineering isn't for everyone. And so you want to find the best players you can get, but I agree with you. You want to get people who want to be at Georgia Tech.
Right. And there's programs now that weren't there when I was there, when your dad was there, that are there now, so that you can slack up a little bit on the requirements for academics. You still have to study, but you can get out into music, or you can get out into about anything you want to do. Mm-hmm. But and I think bragging about how hard we are is probably not helping. But all these kids now got into school. That's the main thing, and some of them are graduating. But if you want to keep the traditions of Georgia Tech, even the Bobby Cremus years, Whitecatter only had one person not to graduate. That was Peanut Murphy. He got a good job with UPS in his hometown, and he took it and he retired from there, vice president or something. He did very well, but he didn't go back to get his degree. But a lot of Bobby's people graduated, some sooner than later. But that can be done now a lot easier than it used to be. But you got to sell it. You got to have our recruiting budget. It bothers me that the 24 year was higher than the 25 year in the Georgia Tech budget. We almost spent $1 million less in recruiting. Why? Because you just you take recruiting sites, you look at film, you don't get out there and do the shoe leather wearing out of recruiting like Dwayne Marson did. You put your 6 coaches on the bench. Who's recruiting the same Tuesday nights or Saturday nights or Friday nights when the players are playing? Who's scouting? Instead of looking at videos, who's sitting there watching the University of Georgia play the game before you play? I mean, that's coaching. He's got the people to do it. You just got to go do it. You don't need strength coaches. You don't need to be stronger. You need to be quicker. I got some, but nobody wants to hear my stories on that, but I'd love to talk to somebody about it.
Well, thanks for coming on. I know I went over time by about 30 minutes, and I'm sorry about it.
You get to be the editor, right?
Yeah, I'll edit this. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you to Tommy for coming on. And he's a true Tech man. I know you love Georgia Tech very much, probably more than I do. And thank you for coming and sharing your stories. And thank you.
My daddy did go there in 1928 to see Wrong Way Wriggles. So, yeah, I have a long history with Georgia Tech.
Well, thank you for coming on, and thank you, everybody, for listening.